So now I very happily welcome Maestro back to Talking Opera.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy, for that lovely introduction. And it's great to see so many of you via Zoom. Wow, this is what we've been up to for the past year. And even though I think we're all kind of dealing with a bit of Zoom fatigue, but I have to say we're grateful that we have the technology because it has helped keep us together and making music and being together in community in kind of a digital way, but nonetheless, that's been, I think, a really good thing. But this summer, we will be able to be live together at the Glimmerglass Festival, celebrating the festival outside on the brand new Andrew Martin Weber stage that is currently under construction on the south end of the campus. And we are all just so looking forward as I can tell you I'm not upstate yet. I'm still down at home in New Jersey, but plan to be arriving in Cooperstown on the 20th of June. So I'm looking forward to that really with great joy and pleasure to get started with live rehearsals and get the season launched. So as I usually do, this is an annual talk that I've done for the Guild, and kind of a prep, especially of the pieces that I'm going to conduct for the season. And so I'm very, very happy to kind of give you a rundown on this very, very special season. In fact, what we can sort of call this evening's time we spent together, I'm going to be talking to you about special versions for special times. I mean, this is really a special time we're in, a challenging time. And I think we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I know I certainly can, and I'm enjoying watching it grow bigger and bigger every day. So these special times require us to program a kind of season that is a very, very special and very particular kind of season. What has been a bit of a challenge for us artistically in the company is as we began to think about reopening and planning a 2021 season. Of course, as you know, opera requires planning a lot of months, even years in advance. And so there was a constant shifting ground under our feet because the guidelines were changing. When we started meeting and planning, the vaccines were just about ready to appear. Then is, well, will people get vaccinated? And then that curve going up, and then the CDC and New York State begin to change what is possible for us to do. So that it's really been a kind of shooting at a moving target. And you take, in many ways, your reverent best guess. And I think a lot of that is going to pan out really, really beautifully this summer for this 2021 season. So a lot of the plans we had to make were obviously earlier in the year when guidelines were different. Now things are starting to shift and open up in a positive way, which is good. But we're thrilled that we're able to present this very, very special season. So one of the important things that you do when you're planning this kind of season is the reimaginings of the operas. The idea that, an audience comes, they're used to, an hour first act, an intermission, and then another hour second act. And during the intermission, they have a chance to walk around, maybe, use the restroom, get a glass of wine, just kind of stroll the grounds. And of course, that is not possible. So this year we decided we would make all of our musical offerings and programs maximum of 90 minutes in length. And that meant we needed to reimagine our operatic offerings. And I have to say, one can look at the pandemic and as we all know, it has been absolutely devastating for the arts. However, it's given us an opportunity to kind of step back and rethink and say, are there other ways to produce opera? Are there other ways to think about how opera can be structured? And we have done just that and are really preparing quite an exciting season. So what's the process for creating these 90-minute reimaginings of operas? Well, it begins, of course, with initial meetings and discussions between stage director, dramaturg, conductor. All of these people have to get together and they have to make decisions and ask questions. Here are some of the questions that we ask. What is the music we absolutely must have? When you're presenting a particular version or a reimagining of an opera, are there arias? Are there ensembles? Are there things that you simply cannot do without? And remember, this is a dilemma because arias, as we know, are stopping points for emotional expression, right? We get ourselves to a point via recitative or spoken dialogue, which advances the plot. And then we're suddenly at that point where we say, I love, I hate, I'm ecstatic, I'm joyful, I'm sad. One of those emotional points. And when we're there, the plot sort of doesn't move forward with as much speed, let's say. So the idea then of saying, well, why don't we just take all the arias and ensembles out and just do recitative or dialogue? And of course, that would be a disaster. So there has to be a very, very special and careful decision made with how you're going to tell the story, how the story is going to proceed. Another question we ask, can we look for another angle to tell the story? Now, of course, this can involve reordering of scenes. You know, we're all used to operas being in a certain act one goes this way and has two scenes, and then we have an intermission, act two does this, and those particular scenes go in that order. And remember that we can always reorder, we can always rethink. We can use new translations of the text. We can combine secondary roles so that rather than have 3 secondary roles, sometimes it's possible to have that become one single role or one single character. So there are a lot of ways that we can sit back and we can really reimagine how an opera is put together and how we can think using the spirit of the composer and using the sense that the composer and the librettist have given us in terms of how the story is going to be related, and look for new angles, new ways to tell that story. Now, another question we would ask, is a different musical soundscape appropriate in the telling of the story? And a composer has to think, in fact, we're doing Il Trovatore by Verdi this summer, and those of you who have heard me speak on Verdi before know that Verdi employed what he referred to in Italian as the tinta of an opera. That is the color, okay? Tint is the word we would use in English. In other words, an orchestral color. And all of Verdi's operas have a particular tinta. Rigoletto, for example, has a very, very dark color. It's dominated with low-sounding instruments, clarinets and bassoons and low strings, low brass instruments. Un ballo e maschera has a very brilliant tinta, which features high brass, high horn, piccolo, very prominent, high string writing. So each of the operas of Verdi always have a particular tinta or color that kind of helps to advance the story or provide the atmosphere. So we have to think about, not only in Verdi, but Mozart and Wagner and American musical theater, what is the color, what is the soundscape that telling the story in a new way, can that change? Would we use a different musical soundscape? Now, this is also influenced by the practicality of producing an opera during a pandemic, okay, because physical distancing requires more space for the orchestra. So those of you that have been coming to Glimmerglass, you may remember a couple of seasons ago, I conducted Janacek's The Cunning Little Vixen. And if you look down into the pit, you saw one of the tightest pits that we have ever used in my time at Glimmerglass, because there are so many instruments and keyboards and elaborate percussion. So the players were pretty closely packed together. So for pandemic, of course, we have guidelines that are telling us, and restrictions, that we have to keep the orchestra separate. So we will not be using the pit this summer. And in fact, I'll give you some more specifics about that. But that also will change the soundscape, because in a way, we're not able to use as large an orchestra as we would normally use. And so that, because of the physical distancing, because of the amount of space that we're limited to, how can we change the original soundscape of the opera so that we have something that is yet appropriate, but yet able to be produced according to the CDC guidelines during a pandemic? So that has a lot of bearing on what we do. Now, how do we create these new musical soundscapes? That's another question that comes up. And of course, audience, performer, and staff safety, this is absolutely crucial. That's why we've moved the new stage from our normal indoor setting now to an outdoor setting. And what is practical then for the orchestra in terms of placement? We had to think, do we put the orchestra outside with the singers? Do we find another place for the orchestra? Will amplification be necessary because audience is outside? We don't have the beautiful acoustic of the Alice Bush Opera Theater. So a lot of these questions come up. And then how do we deal with any separation between orchestra and singers and conductor? Will we use video? How will we handle the conductor and singer communication if they're physically separated and can't see each other? What about the sound? So these are the questions that are asked when we begin this process of looking into and exploring how to produce a season with the pandemic challenges, and yet to do something that is artistically viable and certainly artistically refreshing and wonderful and exhilarating for an audience, because we're thinking this might be the first kind of live music a lot of people are hearing in over a year, and we want to really make sure that we do it to the very, very best of our abilities. So these are the questions that we ask along the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer back to these questions, and I'm going to talk about a lot of the individual productions and give you some of the specifics so that it will kind of prep you so you have a sense when you come to the theater what you'll be hearing, what's special about it, and maybe some of the background that might not be apparent, but that it'll give you the sense of kind of seeing the workings of the clock, as it were. Now, the repertory for the 21 season will be a piece that we're calling Songbird, and this, of course, is the English translation of Jacques Offenbach's La Péricole, a wonderful operetta of 1868. We will be doing a special version of that. We'll do a special version also of Il Trovatore, Verdi's iconic opera of 1853. And remember, that was a great year for Verdi because he wrote two operas and two important premieres that year. He had Trovatore in the early part of 1853, around February, and then toward the end of the year, La Traviata. So two operas that are extremely different. Il Trovatore, which is very kind of looking a little bit to past tradition, and La Traviata, where he looks forward. In fact, a lot of operas of Verdi, as some of you maybe have heard me say before, a lot of the operas of Verdi alternate in this way. The forward-looking operas, and then the operas where he turns back, forward and back. So you have this fantastic dichotomy in the works of Verdi. And this Trovatore, of course, is one of the great iconic operas, and has a lot of wonderful, significant things in it that we'll talk about in a little bit. We're also doing a special version of The Magic Flute of Mozart. This opera came from 1791, which, of course, as many of you know, is the year of Mozart's death. So it's one of Mozart's final works, completed really just before the Requiem, which, of course, he did not complete. But the Magic Flute represents the absolute mature Mozart, mature if we can call it that, at the tender age of 35. And then we're doing a concert program that we are entitling Gods and Mortals. And this, of course, will feature music from the operas of Richard Wagner. And you will hear selections from Lohengrin and Tannhäuser, Die Feen, his early opera, Die Walküre, Das Rheingold. You will hear a lot of your favorite Wagner. I'm happy to say that even though this is repertory that we don't perform very often at Glimmerglass, but everyone is so excited about this program and the cast we've assembled for it. What was tricky about this program is deciding what repertory really works in the outdoors. You make a list of the great hits of Wagner, and that, of course, has to include things like the Liebestod from Tristan und Isolde. And you start thinking, wow, it's one of the great works of Wagner, and yet there's a lot of soft playing and a lot of soft singing at the beginning. It's a very intimate expression of the love death. So works like that, much as we love them, we have to be careful what works best in the outdoor setting. And we have chosen some wonderful moments from Wagner that I think will work extremely well in the outdoor setting. I think they're going to be hearing some of that program in Utica just by opening the windows. So I'm really looking forward to this Wagner Gods and Mortals concert program. We're also performing another concert program featuring selections from American musical theater, which we're entitling To the World. And this will be exploring American musical theater works that connect us globally. So there'll be excerpts from Fiddler on the Roof and Bernstein's On the Town, sometimes Into the Woods, Hello Dolly, Pippin, a number of wonderful works that will take us kind of for an American musical theater tour around the world. And I think it's going to be a really, really wonderful and delightful evening. We're also presenting a new work, The Passion of Mary Cardwell Dawson, which is a new play based on a new play by Sandra Seaton that celebrates Mary Cardwell Dawson, who was the founder of the National Negro Opera Company, with music contributed to this by Carlos Simon. So it's a wonderful new work celebrating this company. Some people know about this company, which was formed in 1941, and others don't. And this will give you a wonderful opportunity to kind of learn about that company, but also to get a sense of what a rehearsal situation would have been like for them. And of course here, because it's a new work that we are premiering, this means that then we have the opportunity to help to shape it so that it will work in the kind of special version situation that we find ourselves in. And so the accompaniment for this piece will be piano, and then with a cast of singers featuring many of the wonderful young artists at Glimmerglass. So it's really quite a wonderful spread of repertory on our main stage this summer. And we are so looking forward to this series of programs and sharing it with you. Okay, so let's go back to our process questions and see how we solved these challenges put before us. Okay, so first question: what is the music we absolutely must have? All right, now this is a crucial question, right? I mean, for example, can we have Il Trovatore, Quella Pira, or Tacea la notte placida? And of course, that would be a resounding no. That would be a resounding unthinkable. We have to have these certain iconic pieces. That's what makes Il Trovatore Il Trovatore. Or could we have the Magic Flute without the great arias of Tamino and Pamina or Papageno, or the Sublime Quintet, okay, in Act 1? I mean, there are just things that we absolutely have to have. So I would start off by making this list of, well, these are the musical pieces I think that we have to find a way to preserve. Now, what is another way of looking at this is that even though you will preserve these pieces, sometimes you're dealing with arias that are strophic. In other words, they have a number of verses. And so we can say, okay, yes, we can keep that aria, but rather than do 3 verses, we can do 2 verses. Rather than do this particular ensemble or finale in its full form, we can make a couple of cuts. We can, preserve the shape of the ensemble, but we can shorten them a bit. And of course, this is something that opera companies have been doing for years and years. So we make a list of those arias ensembles that are iconic to the opera. We know that there are some scenes that can successfully be put aside. We decide if there are multiple verses or sectional repetitions of large ensembles and finales that we can cut. And then this first draft gives us a basic sketch of the reimagining of the opera. Now, I like to think with Il Trovatore that we are operating directly in the spirit of Giuseppe Verdi. Yes, I know the purists will often say, oh, but you can't cut a single note of Verdi. But, you know, even Verdi himself sanctioned cuts to his operas and made them himself. In fact, we have the letters of Verdi to his various librettists, such as Camarano, the librettist of Trovatore, or Francesco Maria Piave, the librettist of works like Rigoletto and Traviata, in which he writes constantly, no, too many words, troppo parole, più brevi, I need it to be shorter, less words. So Verdi was always looking for the essence of the drama, the complete essence of the drama every time. And this, I believe, functioning in this way, reimagining these works into this briefer form, allows us to operate and take Verdi one or two steps further. And came to me in a dream the other night and said to me, Maestro, bravissimo, Trovatore sarà benissimo. So I know it's all going to be good, and I have the blessing of Verdi. Now, Magic Flute is a number opera, right? That means that each aria or musical ensemble is self-contained. And of course, the original form of Mozart's Magic Flute is a Singspiel, which means a German opera that has music and it has dialogue in between. So rather than sung recitative, we have singing and we have spoken dialogue. And of course, we are preserving the dialogue to advance the story in between the musical selections. But that makes the reimagining of an opera like the Flute much easier, because you know you have specific numbers. It begins here and it ends there. So either you're going to keep it, or you're going to shorten it, or you're going to excise a particular number. So there are a lot of ways that a number opera functions in an easier way. Its basic structure allows it to be reimagined and presents fewer musical and artistic challenges. Verdi, of course, more through composed, is a little bit more challenging to do. But I know that you will thoroughly enjoy these versions, which absolutely preserve the musical and dramatic essence of each of these works. Now, another one of the questions that we can return to is, can we look for another angle to tell the story? And let's look a little bit about, or talk a little bit about Songbird, Offenbach's operetta, La Pericole, that we are presenting, again, in a 90-minute version. So the director for La Pericole is our general and artistic director, Francesca. And her idea was to set the opera in New Orleans, which we all thought in the initial meeting was a fantastic idea. But what that did is that idea then led us to think, okay, what do we do about the text? Kelly Rourke, who's our dramaturg, has an English translation that we were talking about using. But then with the idea of New Orleans, which of course, as you know, in the 19th century, was a largely French-speaking city, besides being English-speaking city, she suggested that maybe we rework the libretto so that we have some of the numbers sung in French and some of them sung in English. So we are presenting this kind of dual language version, which will fit in perfectly with a New Orleans setting, where there are people who speak English but also speak French. So it will give us a really wonderful flavor for the place. When we were thinking about different angles for Il Trovatore, Francesca Zambello, who's also directing that, she and I had a discussion about changing the angle of the story from Azucena's standpoint, seeing the story in a new way. Now, those of you who know Il Trovatore know that the libretto is notoriously grim and it is notoriously difficult to follow. It has many gaps in it. People are having conversations and someone will say, but am I your son? And someone will say, oh, didn't I tell you that? No, forget that. I didn't tell you. So there's information that kind of gets passed and then kind of take it away. There are issues, not so much with the play, but the way that Camarano adapted Garcia Gutierrez's play El Trovador into the Italian libretto. And sometimes when you're reducing a play with a lot of scenes and a lot of characters, very often things have to get left out, especially with Verdi constantly browbeating his librettists and telling them, I want it shorter, less words, I want just the essential scenes. And sometimes there's information that can get sent into the byway. And that happens frequently in Il Trovatore. Or which baby gets thrown into the fire and which baby gets saved, and who that baby is now growing up, and is the count's brother really alive? And you know what I mean? The story can get a little convoluted. So in Camerano's original, the first scene of the opera, the details of the story are first told by Ferrando. That is one of the Count's men. And then in the second scene of Act 1, we have the story told from Azucena's standpoint. We are going to reverse this order. We're going to start by telling the story from Azucena's standpoint, and then bringing you Ferrando's standpoint. Now, what this will do is it's going to put the emphasis quite strongly on the character Azucena. Now, again, any of you here from the Verdi Purity Society might say to me, oh, but you can't do that. However, when Verdi was first composing Il Trovatore, he looked at the character of Azucena. First of all, he was very intrigued by this character. This is the first major mezzo-soprano character that Verdi set. Okay, the great mezzos that follow, like Eboli and Amneris and Aida. Azucena is kind of the benchmark for this kind of character. So it's the first of these major characters. He had written for the mezzo-soprano before, in Nabucco, in Rigoletto, Maddalena, you know these roles. But Azucena is a big principal part that is very, very crucial to the telling of the story. She's a central character. Verdi was so taken with this character that he was considering naming the opera not Il Trovatore, but Azucena. And so in the spirit of Verdi, we thought, why don't we let Verdi have his way at Glimmerglass this summer? And so we're going to tell the story at the beginning from the standpoint of Azucena. She is the first major character that you will meet at the beginning of the opera. So we reorder those scenes, and it gives us a new perspective without a reorganization, or I should say a reworking of Verdi's music, simply a repositioning. Now, Magic Flute, the whole story is going to unfold from Sarastro. Because we had to think, what do we do with all this spoken dialogue, all these different characters? And, you know, the original spoken dialogue in the Magic Flute is like a little play by itself. And if you were to do all the spoken dialogue in the flute, you'd be in the theater all night long. However, we are going to take the original dialogue. We're doing the opera in English, and we are taking the original dialogue from Scicaneta, and it is going to be formed into a sort of a storybook form that's going to be read and narrated by the character Sarastro, whom, as you know, is the all-knowing. He is the kind of the character that kind of presides over the whole opera and helps to guide those who are perceived as evil to coming back into the fold. So this will be an interesting way, again, preserving Mozart and Scicaneta's original structure of the opera, but finding a new way to relate that story. We'll also be combining certain characters. For example, as you know, the three ladies, two sopranos and a mezzo, that form an important part of the telling of the story. And then we have these three genies, which are usually taken by three children's voices. We're going to combine those characters so that we'll have the three ladies, and the music and text that originally goes to the three genies is now going to go to the three ladies. So we are reimagining a new way for the three ladies to relate, react, and to take their part in the telling of the story. The English text, of course, is wonderful because it will give the work the original immediacy of a Singspiel. So when audiences heard it at the world premiere in 1791 and heard it in German, of course, German audience, they heard it arias and ensembles sung in German and the text spoken in German. This will give our audiences the sense of the same immediacy to hear the opera in the original language. And I must say, Magic Flute is one of those operas that I have done before. I've done in German and I've done in English. And I have to say it works really beautifully in English because German and English are languages that are quite similar in construct and in the kind of tonic accent that they have. There are many, many similarities. And there is a sense of relational, an artistic relational quality that connects the German text with the English text. So I think you will find that really quite provoking in a way and sounding really quite natural, as if Mozart had written originally for the text. Often when you go from Italian to English translation, those languages are very, very different. Vocalic structure and consonant structures and all of that has a very, very different kind of sound. But English and German can be very much like hand and glove, and they work very, very beautifully. Now let's go back and address this question we had also talked about earlier. Is a different musical soundscape appropriate in the telling of the story? Well, again, as we thought about producing Offenbach's Songbird in a New Orleans setting, I said in a meeting, hey, what would everybody think about doing this instead of with Offenbach's kind of 19th century French orchestra? How about a New Orleans jazz band? Since that's the music, that's the color of the place. We are very lucky to have Jim Lau, who has been a frequent guest conductor at Glimmerglass. And Jim is coming to conduct Songbird with us this summer. And Jim jumped at the idea and even said, will you allow me to make the musical adaptation? So I said, go for it. And he has come up with a really, really charming New Orleans style score, preserving all of Offenbach's arias, tunes, ensembles, but the orchestra is going to be a clarinet, a trumpet, a trombone, a piano, a bass. There will be, as Jim likes to call them, the collection of percussion toys. There'll be a drum set and all kinds of little, slide whistles and things like that to make the piece really fun. If you're a fan of New Orleans jazz, you are going to love this version. And not only is the orchestra going to have this New Orleans jazzy soundscape, but there's going to be, from the stage, from the singers, a sense of swing about the lines, because you can't just do it straight on. So Jim said to me, is it okay if we swing some of the numbers? And I said, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And so I suggest that before you come to the theater, maybe you get yourself and make yourself a nice thermos of Sazeracs, to enjoy during the performance. If you need a recipe for Sazerac, I can get you one. And it's going to have a real wonderful New Orleans flavor. So again, the different adaptation, the different reimagining of the opera got us all thinking in new ways about how we would reimagine this, even down to the kind of orchestra that we would use. And also quite wonderful in the same spirit. Remember that operetta of the 19th century has its roots in Paris. In fact, Offenbach we can consider in many ways to be the founder of operetta. Operetta was a French form that then made its way to Vienna and was picked up by Strauss and Johann Strauss and Lehar, So the idea, though, is very French. And what made operetta so wonderful is, in 19th century Paris, it was the operatic capital of the world, mid 19th century Paris, and there was every kind of theatrical entertainment that you can imagine, from the kind of very simple, unstructured vaudeville, which were revues and comedies, and were done, usually in big vaudeville halls or cafes. There was also the opera comique, which was like German Singspiel, in that it had singing plus dialogue in between. There was also the opera lyrique, which were more serious kinds of subjects. The opera comique didn't necessarily mean comic in the sense of humorous, but it meant from in the sense of a Greek comedy, that it had characters from everyday life. Bizet's Carmen, for example, is an example of opera comique of this period. Opera lyrique, Gounod's Faust, falls into that category. And these are operas of a more serious nature. And then you have the Grand Opera. This was the opera that performed the works of Meyerbeer, for example, and Halévy. These were the big, large-scale romantic operas with ballets and huge choruses and big, elaborate scenes and all those great effects performed at all the major big opera houses, like the Garnier, for example, later on in the 19th century in Paris. So there was nothing, though, that was bridging the gap between opera comique and the vaudeville. And Offenbach came by with operetta because it had the kind of structures and forms and the seriousness musically of opera comique and lyrique, but it also had the dance forms and the popular music and the comic routines that you find in the vaudeville. So it filled the necessary gap. And so our production will be in that spirit. In other words, an operetta that features popular dance of that period of the 19th century, that features the kind of popular music. And in our case, it's going to be the New Orleans jazz swing. So again, we are operating very much in the spirit of what Offenbach was doing with this piece. So remember, these decisions that we make as we began looking at these reimaginings of these operas for our season are all done with a very, very close look at the spirit of these works. What was the composer trying to achieve? What was the artistic culture around these works at the time? And using those ideas as springboards to get us to where we've come. And we're all really very excited about this particular idea. Certainly with flute, we had to have a nod to physical distancing, and the intimacy of this production with certain roles being combined, and the idea of Sarastro becoming a narrator. That led me to thinking we might want to think about an orchestra that closely mirrors Mozart's more intimate works. Rather than his theatrical orchestras, which consists of double winds, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, trumpets, 3 trombones, timpani, string, full string orchestra, we decided in this case to look a little bit toward the serenades or the divertimentos of Mozart. And of course, these wonderful works, which were written for all kinds of secular occasions and dinners and parties and celebrations and that kind of thing, sometimes he used just a group of woodwinds, 6, 8 winds. Sometimes it would be a small string orchestra with some oboes and flutes and clarinets. The famous Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which we know is one of Mozart's iconic works, is one of his wonderful works of this type for string orchestra only. So in other words, there are a lot of ways to reimagine these works. And so I have made a version of the Magic Flute which uses woodwinds and strings and French horns, 2 French horns. So it's going to have the color and intimacy and wonderful kind of chamber music expression of a Mozart serenade or divertimento, which I think will work beautifully in this kind of reimagined special version of the Magic Flute. Now, Il Trovatore, of course, again, physical distancing was an issue for us because of how many musicians we could actually fit in the space. And so we are reimagining the orchestra a bit. But unless you really know this piece really well, I wonder if you might even hear it. Percussion had to be reduced a bit, but yes, there will still be anvils in the anvil chorus. Again, all that's essential will be preserved. Certain lines that go into certain instruments in the original are now moved to other instruments. So all the notes are there, all the harmony is there, all the counterpoint is there. Just I have reimagined it in a different way so that we can provide a space for as many musicians as we can. Because again, our goal was to get our company back to work for 2021, to get the singers, to get the young artists, to get our interns and our staff and our orchestra, get all of these people, our designers, all these people back to work again. And again, there are some places you might go where, you know, you might see operas, for example, during the pandemic performed only with piano. And there are certain things that we decided that we would do, and we would do our very, very best to employ as much of the Glimmerglass Festival company as would be possible. And so I think we found an excellent solution for this. Common practice, you know, in small theaters with small pits in Italy, we can find clues in some of the orchestra parts. For example, Verdi wrote originally Il Trovatore for 4 French horns. We're going to use 3. Because if you look in the orchestra parts, you find many cases where Verdi will have written in, if there is no 4th horn, 3rd horn plays this. So in other words, he himself knew that there were theaters that this opera was going to travel to, certainly in small towns in Italy, where they didn't have big orchestras, or where they didn't have full percussion sections, or they didn't have a big string section, or they couldn't put together enough musicians to make a stage band, you know, the off-stage music that you hear in Verdi so often. And so he would score into the pit orchestra the off-stage music. So Verdi himself was a very practical composer and understood the importance of being able to make rearrangements as needed. And again, in Verdi's spirit, we have done just that for this special pandemic time. Now, of course, dealing with Wagner, I kind of quailed at the thought at first because I thought those orchestras are gigantic. And they are. This was the hardest project to rearrange and reimagine of all. First of all, it was really important that we decided on a concert, because you're not going to find any opera of Wagner that you can really trim down to a kind of a 90-minute period without really cutting a lot of the music out. As you know, Wagner was, how should we say, musically verbose. It's all wonderful, but it's all long. Remember, Wagner has written a one-act opera called Das Rheingold. And that one-act opera, in a fast version, takes 2 hours and 25 minutes. Okay, so when Wagner was thinking short, that's what he was thinking. When he was thinking long, you just think Götterdämmerung, think Parsifal, 6 hours in the theater, you know, you're there. The Ring, it has to be performed over 4 different days. So, you know, Wagner is long. Art is brief. Wagner is long. However, the concert gives us a perfect opportunity to be able to choose selections. And I'm happy to say we have some good, lengthy, wonderful scenes like Wotan's Farewell from Die Walküre, and then wonderful moments like Ortrud's Curse, which is 2.5 minutes of an absolute kind of mad scene for Ortrud. So we've done a wonderful selection, I think, of these works. I spent a lot of time kind of inside Wagner's head the last several weeks, and then handing this project on to the library. And I have to say hats off to our wonderful librarian, Kristen Butcher, who has been working really hard in helping to prepare the orchestra parts, where I would send her a full score that had you know, yellow highlighter markings go from here to here, and this instrument goes from there to there. And in one case, trying to deal with chromatic horns, and this is in this key and that's in another key. I used to find myself working late at night on this, and it was like doing puzzles late at night. I used to think sometimes, wow, I hope I can stay awake. And before you know it, 2 hours would pass and be 1:30 or 2 a.m. And I think, oh my God, I'm still going, because you're thinking, how will I solve this? What was Wagner thinking here? Was he thinking that? Was he thinking that? Well, maybe I should do this, or maybe what color should I try to preserve? So again, it's a very, very careful process. And again, I think I am so excited to share this Wagner program with you. Now, again, creating these musical soundscapes, exactly how do I go about it? You start with the original full score, especially with Wagner. My God, you look at it, you look at all those instruments, all those brass instruments, 4 French horns and 4 Wagner tubas and trombones and bass tubas and 6 harps. And I mean, it's daunting. However, you look for what doubles. Very often, Wagner would have something doubled in 3 or more instruments. You decide what is essential for the counterpoint, what is essential for the harmony, what can be reassigned. And I will tell you, the color changes that this will bring about will bring out new and interesting ways for you to hear these pieces, a new kind of transparency. I think one of the most important things when you go to a really great performance of Wagner is that the orchestra, as big as it is transparent because of all the leitmotifs and all of the thematic material and Wagner's particular kind of harmonic writing. It's very important that you can hear all of this. And you can go to performances sometimes where it just sounds like a big wash of sound, and that's not Wagner. So the spirit that we're in with this rearranging of the huge Wagner orchestra for smaller forces allows you to hear the piece with more intimacy, more immediacy, and more transparency. So if you have heard these works before, you're going to hear them in a new and wonderful way. If you're hearing them for the first time, they'll give you a good basis so that when you hear them next time with a big orchestra, Wagner's original, you'll say, fantastic. I have a good sense of what the structure is. But for those of you that know these works, you will hear a new intimacy and transparency in these arrangements, which I think you're going to find really intriguing and really quite wonderful. Again, as I mentioned, the Mary Cardwell Dawson piece, which is accompanied only by piano, it was decided to use piano accompaniment because it would keep our forces simpler. And it would allow us also to do the whole piece outside with the piano on the outdoor stage as well too. So it will give it a different kind of sound feeling that we won't be doing with the other works. Because remember, one of our important questions was what is practical for the orchestra in terms of placement. Now, we went with the outdoor stage. Again, safety guidelines for our audience, performers, and staff to have audience outside, to have performers outside, staff working outside. Okay, can you put the orchestra outside? Well, now this becomes impractical. You have direct sun, you have heat, you have strong breezes sometimes. And this can be really difficult for the orchestra. It can be distracting and also doesn't allow for the proper amplification and enhancement of the sound. In my day at the Met Opera, I did a number of opera in the park presentations on that special stage that was built for the New York Philharmonic. Maybe some of you saw them. Good 10 years ago, I did Nabucco, I did Turandot, I did Rigoletto. And I remember on nights when there was a threat of rain. I remember Turandot, we got almost to the end. In fact, it felt like the famous world premiere when Toscanini put the stick down at the end of The Death of Liu and said, here the opera ended with the death of the composer, and left the podium and didn't perform Franco Alfano's completion of Act 3 of Turandot. And there was one night where I kind of felt the same way. I put the stick down and said, because of rain, we can't complete the opera. because one thing you cannot do is have the musicians with these wonderfully expensive instruments that they play with rain coming down on them and all of that. So for us, the safest and best thing to do was to put the orchestra in the theater. So the Glimmerglass Festival Orchestra will be coming to you from the stage, not the pit, but the stage of the Alice Bush Opera Theater. And about, I don't know, eighth of a mile away, maybe, the singers will be outside on the south end of the campus. Now you may say, how will you coordinate this? Well, it's going to be a challenge, but not an insuperable challenge. We have at our disposal some of the very, very best sound designers in the business, including our own in-house sound chief, Joe Moraine. And I have had a meeting with them, and I have placed every confidence in this team. This is going to be an incredible team because they're going to have us in the theater. They're going to amplify the sound of the orchestra out onto the lawn stage. The singers will be able to hear it as well as the audience. The singers, instead of watching the conductor in front of them, will watch a video monitor like you're watching now with the picture of the conductor. And the conductor will be inside in front of the orchestra on the stage. The orchestra, of course, will be all, and conductors, so physically distanced, in masks as needed. And conductor will have behind the orchestra a video monitor with the stage and sound monitor. So the singers are going to have to get used to the fact that the conductor cannot breathe with them live. They can see a picture of me doing, but when that baton comes down, they have to sing because the orchestra is going to play. We'll be able to hear each other, but there will be a distance. In other words, there won't be a delay in the sound, because I was very clear with the sound team on this, and they said that it's measured in milliseconds. So they said, you will never be aware of it. And I said, okay, I'm going to hold you to that promise. We will be able to make this work because I had an experience, Kathy mentioned in the intro to me, several years ago. What was actually fall of 2018. I did a special concert version, semi-stage version of Aida at San Diego Opera. And we had the orchestra and chorus on the stage, and the singers were behind me and to the side on a thrust on the stage. And we used video monitors and sound monitors, and although I had the singers live in the room with me, but I was a little doubtful about whether we'd be able to pull this off, and it worked really, really well. And the audience kind of loved the idea of the intimacy of it, having the singers so close rather than singing across the gulf of an orchestra pit. I just recently completed a terrific filming project of Donizetti's The Elixir of Love, L'Elisir d'Amore, with the wonderful young artists of the Juilliard School. That's going to be available on the Juilliard website, free to the public in August. And we'll be sure to let you know if you'd be interested in seeing that. And again, we were in the Juilliard Theater, no audience, orchestra on the stage, singers behind, and again, done all with video monitoring. And as long as we know this from the beginning of rehearsals, we rehearse in a very specific way so that the singers know where they have to give attention to the focus of the beat that's coming across on a video monitor. So happily, as I was doing this Elisir d'Amore, I said to myself, aha, I'm really happy now because this is going to be kind of a prep run for me for Glimmerglass this summer. And we had such a great experience with it at Juilliard that I'm really looking forward to doing it this summer for you at Glimmerglass. So I know it's challenging, but we have assembled the best team, and happily we have experienced people that are going to be involved in this kind of musical enterprise. And I think we'll bring it off beautifully. So I'm really, really quite excited about that. So those are the kinds of questions that we ask. But really, the kind of big overarching question for us all was, when can we get back to making live music? When can we get back onto the campus? When can we find some way, even if it's a hybrid situation, some way of having a live audience and live singers and making live music again? And we are only too thrilled, the entire company, I can tell you, I can speak for all of them, to perform live again for all of you, and to do it in community, because Zoom, as good as it was to keep us together, but Zoom is not community. Live community is what we need, and that is what is essential to our art. During the pandemic, I know a lot of people I talked to you had time to read, you had time to study, do other things, and I was doing some reading from the great psychiatrist and philosopher and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, from his wonderful work called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, Viktor Frankl writes this: while he was a prisoner in a death camp, he said, "One evening, when we were already resting on the floor of our hut, dead tired, soup bowls in hand, a fellow prisoner rushed in and asked us to run out to the assembly grounds and see the wonderful sunset. Standing outside, we saw sinister clouds glowing in the west, and the whole sky alive with clouds of ever-changing shapes and colors, from steel blue to blood red. The desolate gray mud huts provided a sharp contrast, while the puddles on the muddy ground reflected the glowing sky. Then, after minutes of moving silence, one prisoner said to another, 'How beautiful the world could be.'" And so that got me thinking that art and music, always in a perpetual search for meaning, and the celebration of that meaning when we find it, especially in community. We have been faced with enormous challenges this past year, and the arts have been particularly devastated. And yet, the world turns to us in the arts community, the most wounded. And they turn to us for meaning, for answers, and for a cause for celebration. And that celebration will be found at the 2021 Glimmerglass season. And we look forward to celebrating all of it with you soon. Thanks for listening. Now, I think Brittany has perhaps curated some questions which are going to come to me via text message on my phone. Okay, here we go. First question. Any specific artistic considerations with 11 a.m. starting times for some shows? Yes. In fact, some of them are pandemic related, because when doing 2 in a day, we have to create enough space between the performances for everything to be wiped down and cleaned and disinfected, orchestra space and all of that. Usually the guidelines are 90 minutes in one space, and then you have to kind of empty it out to let the room rest and kind of exchange air, certainly for orchestra or any staff working inside the theater. So the 11 a.m. start gave us a way of kind of balancing with the 6 p.m. evening and giving us a chance to have enough time to be able to keep the campus safe for audience and performers and staff. Okay, next question. This is a comment from Yvonne. I am traveling to Glimmerglass from Idaho. Oh, great trip. My first air travel since the start of the pandemic. And as an African American, I'm particularly very excited to see The Passion of Mary Cardwell Dawson. Thank you for programming this opera. Well, Yvonne, we are looking forward to meeting you and greeting you at the festival. Please make yourself known to me when you arrive. I'd love to say hello in person. And yes, we are very excited about The Passion of Mary Cardwell Dawson. A big part of the mission of what we do in the arts is not just bringing pleasure and entertainment, certainly, but also addressing important social issues. And this work is helping to focus not only the company but our audience as well on important issues. I always say to audiences, you come to opera and your life is going to be changed because you're going to be thinking about things and encountering ideas that will hopefully make the world a better place. And we hope that this presentation of this new work will do that. Thank you for your comment. Okay. Okay, no other questions. General comments on being excited to be back. Thrilled for that. I am so happy. We're also all thrilled as well too. Other comments, questions? Well, we would usually have this time afterward to kind of gather in the outside space at the Fenimore Museum and have refreshments and chat together. But anyway, I think I will, perhaps you can join me virtually. Of course, I have water here just in case I get a dry throat, but I'm going to put something else a little stronger than water into another glass after this is over. And I look forward to toasting all of you and toasting the 2021 season. And so looking forward to seeing everybody this summer. So be well. In the meantime, stay well, and we will see you all soon. Thank you all. Kathy, do you want to?
Yes, I do have a couple of closing comments. First of all, when I listen to you, I'm so awed. I mean, you didn't have very much time to do this. You really, a very condensed period of time. And just like you bring in all this history that's background, I mean, the knowledge of the time and the composer, and then closing with words of wisdom, because I think you are a wise man, and I'm really glad that you get to work with emerging young musicians. I think they need exposure to those kinds of people. So I have a couple of closing an important closing announcements. First of all, you will use exactly the same Zoom link next week, and you can log into a Talking Opera program. And we're going to be talking to Eric Sean Fogel, who is director of choreography and movement at Glimmerglass. I asked him to focus a lot on Songbird and on the To the World concert, but also to talk a little bit about his role as director of music, of movement and choreography. I mean, it might be different during COVID. I don't know if I should announce the speaker for the final program, but our final program is going to be focused on The Passion of Mary Cardwell Dawson. And I think you will be pleased at the person who's going to give us background on that. I will always close these programs by encouraging you to consider becoming a member of the Guild if you're not already a member of the Guild. Now, we are on the cusp of launching a new website, and I assume that website will have a link to a membership form. Last week, I told you that one of the blessings of membership in the Guild for me was that I get to know some people in the company. And I often say, Maestro knows my name because people in the company we formed relationships with them. But another blessing for me is to form friendships. And I have formed a friendship with Mary Margaret Kuhn, who's been president of the Guild for a couple of years. Her husband, Paul, passed away last week. And because Mary Margaret's my friend, my heart is hurting for her. And she couldn't have done all that she did, I'm sure, last year, and sort of keeping the Guild together, enabling the Guild to raise a significant amount of money for the company, even though the house was dark, without the support of Paul. Paul isn't somebody that I ever got to know very well, but I do pray that Mary Margaret and her family are having some good fellowship this week, and that their faith is helping them to endure this very difficult time of year of life. So I will close again and say that I hope you will join us again next week for another Talking Opera program. Good night. Oh, you have something?
I have one more little thing to do. I notice also that there's an additional question that didn't get picked up, and I do
Okay.
have at it. There was a question that came up about how did we choose which Wagner to include or exclude. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the important things was what music works best in kind of an outdoor setting. So we look for kind of big Wagner pieces. So you're going to hear things like Wotan's Abschied from Walküre. You'll hear the Ride of the Valkyries, things that work in that kind of big kind of setting. But also things that we could spread across our young artist program and some of our guest artists. So we have wonderful tenor Ian Kozira, Ali Shiner, the soprano, and we started thinking of what things are appropriate for them. Eric Owens, for example, and went to Eric and said, okay, what do you want to do? And he said, oh, I want to sing Wotan. So a lot of it was driven also not just by acoustical concerns, but by what we felt would feature our guest artists very well. And we're thrilled to have such a great group of guest artists. So I hope that answers your question. Those were the kind of considerations that came up as we were thinking of the Wagner program.
And I will have one more comment too. I assume you can still buy tickets to go to Glimmerglass on the Grass this summer. And I was a little grumpy at first, having to buy a pod for 4 people when there's only one of me. And my husband doesn't like this art form all that much. But I am able to bring some new people to Glimmerglass because there's room in my pod. So if there's tickets, and if your pod of 4 isn't filled, considering introducing new people to Glimmerglass, it's a wonderful place, and I look forward to being there again. So this really is good night. See you next week.